Good afternoon, everyone. And while you're all complaining about your chilly weather, yes, we love it though. I'm from Syracuse, the snowiest city in the United States, of any size. There's not counting Alaska. So I'm so thrilled to be here in this beautiful building. It's not my first time to Vancouver, but it's my first time to this university. You are very, very fortunate to have this space. The space, you know, it's kind of interesting, and I just want to go out and sit there for a few hours in that room. I'm going to race through this a little bit. That's because I'm from the East Coast. I apologize. It's just how I go. And but raise your hand anytime if something's not clear, you want to ask a question. I don't mind. And I want to leave at least 15 minutes at the end, which is a little bit why I'm racing a bit, so that we can go over some of the examples. I've handed out a couple for you in the handout, and just you can test your own strength in evaluating a classification just after a short hour of me talking to you. I hope you get some ideas that you can use in your toolkit. So just to, you know, I'm not going to go into I could talk a long time about what a classification is and isn't and how it works and so forth. But, you know, essentially, classification is used to cluster things usefully. And what many people forget about, it's also used to make useful distinctions. So people always think about the clustering, but they sometimes don't think about the rules by which you make the difference between one class and another, one kind of thing and another. Now, the reason I love classifications, even the crappy ones, you know, is because they can, even when they aren't very good, or they aren't very good by some kind of formal standards, they can still be very useful. They can show patterns. They're used to communicate. And the other thing is that when we classify things and make a classification, we represent what we already know, because you have to know something to make a classification, but you can also then discover things you don't know just by looking at the classification that you've created. And you can extrapolate from the order, or you can speculate on missing things and anomalous patterns that you see. So classification schemes, as I say, reflect what we know about things. But the more important thing that I'm going to concentrate on today is that they also reflect the classifier, the person or the organization that devised the classification. And there isn't a classification out there that is sacred, you know what I mean, that does not have behind it a human being or some human endeavor or some human policy behind it. It's a mental thing. It's a conceptual artifact, and to forget about that is to sometimes put yourself in a position of not being very not being evaluative about it. Now, it's very easy to bash a classification, and I don't like to do that. Even the ones I used to bash, like the DSM, the mental disorders classification, I just think of that as horrible. But even that has reasons why it is the way it is, and also things that are useful about it that we can gain from it. So I just think that, so when you say, well, that's a terrible classification, it disenfranchises somebody. And then you say, but how? And that's what I'd like to get at today, is to give you precise tools for saying why this classification is or isn't working well. So I'm going to look at the structure of classifications a little bit, and then at this concept of warrant that Claire Bechtel introduced. So I refer you to this article by Claire. Claire retired a few years ago from the University of Toronto Library School, and if there's a reader to read in our field, it would be Claire. She's lucid, she's accessible, she's a deep thinker. And this article, written in 1986, was when she was still a doctoral student, so really quite impressive. But first, let's look at these criteria. And I'm not going to go through every single one, but most of them, hospitality, expressiveness, I'm not going to read the list. So you're looking there saying, how can a classification be fertile? Well, you'll soon find out. So let's first look at hospitality. And this refers to the ability of a classification to accommodate new stuff. Right? So if you have a classification of orchids, you discover a new orchid in Brazil, will that classification handle that new phenomenon? Do you have enough in that classification to actually bring that new thing in? I was staying in Glasgow, across from the Botanical Gardens, and their gardens are planted systematically, meaning by classification. There was a huge fight about some family of rhododendrons, and one side lost, and they had to dig up the rhododendrons and, move them. So these aren't trivial things to some people. But let me show you one example here. We have a new faculty kind in our school called Professors of Practice. We also have a faculty policy. The faculty policy is entrenched in university traditions of tenure. Professors of practice do not go for tenure. So we needed to revise the policy, the classification of faculty, and we could not do it by just search and replace. We had to revise the policy because the old policy was not hospitable to this new concept in a way that we were happy to, and it's not that it wasn't at all good, it's just that there were things about it that had to be rethought. And so all the time you come across this. Expressiveness is the property of a classification that describes whether you've got enough concepts in that classification to accommodate what you want to describe and to organize. So if the scheme is too general, you may not accommodate the need for a particular kind of distinction. And if it's too specific, that's not good either. I'll give you an example of expressiveness kind of gone wild at the end of this talk. And, many people think that the more precise and expressive you can make a classification, the better it is. But that's not necessarily so. That can actually work against a classification's strength and, ability to be usable. So here's a concept called requisite variety, which is tied to expressiveness, which means that if you've got a phenomenon and it's complex, the classification that is used to classify it has to be appropriately complex. So if you've got a concept, a phenomenon that's simple, you need a classification that's pretty simple. In other words, making a complicated classification for a simple concept is not necessarily good, and vice versa. So, the typical division of music, classical and popular, very not requisite for my collection, for instance. My collection is so eclectic and runs across things that are nuanced in many genre-bending ways and so forth. The whole idea of genres in music and in art defies, these simple kinds of classifications. Unless that's what you need, sometimes that's exactly what you need, and then that's what you have. So it's not just a question of how many categories you have, but whether they're the right ones, the right level of complexity. So too much precision, and I'm going to skip this example, but I only have one Polish opera, so I don't need a category for that. You know what I mean? It's like I just put it in with something else. Now I'm still talking about CD collections, and of course I don't even do any of that now with iTunes and all of that. I just have playlists and all kinds of other ways of organizing it, but just as an example. Here's another example. Well, you don't have the American Kennel Club, but I think you have something like that here, Canadian Kennel Club. And these are folks who show dogs, and pay attention to bloodlines of dogs. And their classification is a classification of pedigrees, not of dogs, right? So people say it's a dog classification. No, it's not. It's a classification of dog pedigrees. It doesn't really tell you much about dogs at all when you come down to it. So it tells you what classes the dogs are in. It doesn't even go into qualities all that much. If you wanted a good classification of dogs, like on Animal Planet, where it tells you, you know, robustness and personality, and you know, and you can put a mutt in there, and that would be a better classification of dogs for the purposes of buying a dog or, you know, understanding about dogs than the American Kennel Club. But the AKC fulfills its function exactly the way they want it to. It's not that they don't argue. It's just that what I'm saying is there are two different levels of expressiveness that are needed in those two situations. So this isn't the only definition of heuristic. Heuristic means if you're driving down the highway and the speed limit is, what is it here, 100K, right? And you know that you can drive 120 sometimes in some places, but there's police here and here and on certain days and blah, blah, blah. So you develop a little rule of thumb for yourself of how fast you can actually go without getting a ticket, and that's a heuristic, right? That's a little set of rules. There's no proof of this. There's no, you know, it's like a little thing you discover. And the reason that heuristics are so important is that they allow us to think, stimulate thought from things that are incomplete, not proven, and so forth, that they're useful for other things than being absolutely certain, you know, nail it down. And related to that is this notion of fertile, which is when a classification records what we know about something, and by doing that in a very systematic way, it also stimulates new knowledge. So that's how when the periodic table of elements was first developed, you know, 50 years ago, there were elements missing. All the elements we now know were not there. But the arrangement of that table, even though it used different theory and everything to arrange it, stimulated the discovery of those missing elements. And that classification is still robust all this time later because of its underlying, you know, the glue that holds it together is strong, and the evidence for it is very strong. And so it's a classification that has endured many, you know, has evolved, of course, and developed. But it not only recorded things, it also stimulated new discoveries. And that is, you know, in my opinion, the epitome of a classification that is very useful to humankind. Now, a classification is memorable. It means that you can, that the learning curve is low in terms of being able to get to a point where you can use it gracefully. And you know, it's a tricky concept because the simpler the phenomenon, the easier it is to make a little snappy, memorable classification. The more complex the problem, well, then you do not, that might not be the case. You know, you might not be able to just memorize every code in the International Classification of Diseases, but you can memorize some of it. It makes sense at some places. Now, my brother-in-law is a psychiatrist, and he has to use the DSM, whatever, the mental disorders classification. I forget what the initials stand for. But he says it's so not memorable that psychiatrists have to have little gyp sheets that they have to consult each time when it's anything outside of the usual 10, 20 codes that they're using. It doesn't make sense in a way that a psychiatrist understands the notion of mental disorder, and it's tricky, you know, on top of that, and complex. So besides being complex and tricky and not very fundamentally resonant with what he does, it's just a pain in the butt, really. And it is not fertile because it does not lead you to understanding of mental disorders in any kind of organic way. And there's reasons for that, but I don't have time today to tell you why it is the way it is. But it has to do with money. So So if a classification is parsimonious, a parsimony is a quality of expressing something using the least complicated approach. Now, why would you want to do that? Why would you want it to be, just kind of only enough, but not an inch more? Just perfectly. And that is because when a classification is parsimonious, but still adequate in terms of expressiveness, it is clearer. It's easy to use. It's possible to make a classification that is so tangled, that is so many leaves, so many nested concepts. If you've ever seen indexes in the back of, 19th century books with 3 levels of indexing in there and all kinds of other concepts, it's overwrought, it's repetitive, it's redundant, extraneous detail. It's not incorrect in the sense that there's anything wrong in it. It's just not, it's not pretty. It's not, and that makes it also not as usable. And related to that is this notion of elegance, which is that a classification would be simple but sufficient design, a structure that reveals itself. What I mean by that is that you know how it works. You get right away, what it's doing. But it's unobtrusive, so you don't have to keep battling it. You don't have to keep figuring out where you're going with it. And an overall cohesiveness. So it's somewhat easier to maybe understand how it can be inelegant, which would be a classification that is sloppy. Many of them are ad hoc, thrown together. People need a classification, they just make one, And then they worry about later that there are all these entailments, of, well, where do we put X, Y, Z? And we say, well, we put it in miscellaneous. So if you find a classification with a large number of miscellaneouses, you know that somebody has not, either the theory underlying it isn't sufficient to create it, or somebody just didn't think things through and threw it together. And the other thing is carelessly changed over time. In other words, that it's fine when they start, but then as things evolve, nobody's taking care of it, and it becomes messy and kind of Rube Goldberg-like. So before I move on to Warrant, I just want to say that these criteria that I just ran through, and I forgot one about scale, but I'm not going to get into it right now. But if you want, we can talk about it later. These are sometimes mutually exclusive, right? So can anybody here think of 2 things that might not be possible together? 2 qualities of a classification that might be difficult to achieve, all in the same classification? Close your eyes. All right, so let's go back. Elegant and expressive. How could those 2 be difficult to achieve together? Pardon?
We're all in our post-lunch.
Yeah, come on, wake up. Yeah, all right.
Well, elegance implies simplicity, which implies perhaps less detail, whereas expressiveness might imply more detail.
Right, or more complexity. So the detail is one part of it, but complexity might be another. So for some things, it's necessary to have a learning curve. You want this classification to be, like MESH is an example of that, medical subject headings. I don't know, it's not inelegant, but it's so full of things. And pardon? Yeah, so you see what I mean, but it is expressive, right? Yeah, and then some, right. So, right. Another one would be memorable and requisite variety, right? So in order to have a classification that's memorable, you've got to it has to be simple enough or easy enough to memorize or and sometimes you can err on the side of making it just a little too snappy, and missing some things or not getting into enough detail. All right, well, you think about that when you're in the shower next time. So we move to Warrant, and so you can look at a classification. I have my students parse classifications. What are the parts? What are the classes? What are the relationships? What are the, the way in which it goes together, so forth. All of that, you can come up with a high score for a classification, but you still don't know that much about it until you know whether it's good or useful in a particular context. So the sad story I tell is of visiting Lithuania in 1996. This was shortly after their independence, and they were using Library of Congress classification in their library. They were rebuilding the Vilnius University Library and were putting in Library of Congress. I said, why would you want to do that? It's not such a great classification for you here, don't you want to build a classification that is going to reflect your national identity? And they said, we can't afford it because records come. We can buy records with the LCC already attached to it. We'll make some adjustments, and it's more important for us to be up and running than to have the labor of love that it would take to build this thing from scratch. So the Library of Congress classification, as imperfect as it is, well, even for us, but especially for other kinds of applications, gets going in that country, and and hopefully maybe over time there will be some way in which somebody will say, wait. So I'm going to just read this to you because there is really no way to do it. It's like, what is warrant? And so the warrant of a classification system can be thought of as the authority of the classificationist, the authority that the classificationist invokes to justify their decision. What units should be included? How are they divided? How far the subdivisions? How much and where the synthesis? That means the relationships among the classes. What order, citation order? This was more important back in print days. So Warrant covers conscious and unconscious assumptions and decisions that are made about a classification, and what kinds of things are warranted to put into that classification. So when you are learning about legacy systems in library school, the various classification systems that exist, you don't stop and think about those people that were there, in 1912 or whatever, developing H in Library of Congress. What was going through their heads? Where were they drawing their authority from? What was, Dewey just thought he was the authority for all things and everything, so he didn't even have to bother thinking. But, where did that come from? And who says, right? And now they're embedded in our, in our consciousness of what it should be, and yet it's worthwhile every once in a while to go back and to look, and especially if you're coming up with a new one or an adjustment. Dewey Decimal, which is, people love to bash it, but it has been doing a really tremendous job of adjusting and redoing its sections on Islam, for instance, with huge amounts of research and investment of time into it to make it right. But, you start doing that and you say, well, whose version are we going to use? How do we make this so that it's going to be right and at the same time still, reasonable to do? So why are these concepts here? And who says? And who thought this classification up? And under what circumstances? And what is the conceptual framework or theory that connects it? You know, for example, the food pyramid. You know, who knew that it was the dairy industry that made one of the food pyramid, facets dairy? They had a lobby in Congress. There it went, you know. What are the hidden and explicit assumptions? So Claire marks four different kinds of warrant, really three, and the fourth one is like an umbrella. So literary warrant, educational warrant, scientific warrant, and cultural warrant. I'm going to take a peek at the time.
It's 27.
Perfect. So literary warrant is what happens when you base a classification on the collection that you have or the literature that's out there, right? So you look and you see, so the Library of Congress is the perfect example of that. They had a collection. They created the classification around it inductively. Now, it's not that they didn't bring in concepts from elsewhere, you know, oh, great, thanks. To sort of justify that or to enrich that notion. But basically, they were deciding based on what they had. And based on that, they decided what they should have as subject. So, for example, in Library of Congress, there's a whole division on naval science. You know, that wouldn't be normal in a public library, for instance, to have a whole division on naval science. But in the Library of Congress, it made a lot of sense. So the warrant was there for that division. Lots of stuff on history, on geography, and other things like that, political science. So the question that one asks when asking the question of literary warrant is, can this classification that we're creating accommodate and reflect the body of works in the collection or on this topic? But there are issues with this. Because when a collection is started using one kind of literary warrant, you know, for example, the beginning of a collection, you get a collection or you have a collection like in a university, and you come across something like, I don't know if you have it here, but very popular program now in our university at Syracuse is the forensic science program. Everybody wants to be, you know, CSI. And it's a fantastic program. But it is, like library science or information science, a professional program. That is, it's based on science and other things, but it is a body of practice. That is, there is a forensic process that a forensic investigator follows. There's a sequence of events. You have to learn that sequence of events. It's got to be attended to very meticulously. There is professional ethics. There's professional, you know, lots of other things having to do with it. At the same time, the body of the literature comes from the arts, you know, from, for example, from linguistics, from, what do you call it, images, from the humanities, from the arts and humanities, from the social sciences, anthropology, from the applied sciences, like gunshot stuff, and the hard sciences like, what's it, entomology? Is that insects? Yeah, no. Yeah, entomology, right. You know, the study of insects, the study of biological processes, decay, things like that. Now, the sharing of those, so if you've got a collection on forensic science, you've got a collection, and law, and a bunch of other things that go into it. And you can specialize in forensics. So you can specialize in computer forensics and in, you know, other kinds of forensics. At the same time, you are always, the framework is always that of that professional practice, right? So you are not studying entomology big. You're studying entomology as it pertains to dead bodies, right? So you are focusing now. How much of that warrant from the field of entomology is necessary to reflect in a collection that you're building around this? Okay, so you get the problem. Of course, it's it's made so much easier now because you can, in fact, go with a lot of digital documents and things like that. You don't have to hang around. But it used to be when I first came to Syracuse that our collection was in 3 libraries, the Math and Science Library, the regular library, and I forget the third one. So whose warrant is valid here in the field of entomology, and in the field of forensics? And there's more and more of these interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary endeavors that we have in life where the warrant of the core disciplines that comprise it are not quite the same. Scientific warrant is where you base your classification on science or on some philosophical perspective. And it's consistent with scientific and scholarly consensus. And that word consensus is the important one. And so that is what lends the authority. Now, in a university library, those two will often go together, right? The literary warrant of a university and the scientific warrant often intersect, but not always. Oh, here's an example. Whoa, what's this doing here? Well, that's an example of scientific warrant because, as I mentioned before, the periodic table of elements shares the consensus of most chemists. But it's not always the case. So, for example, if you've got a university library in which evolution is considered the norm of science, right? The accepted way in which it's in. You've got a collection on creationist point of view. How do you fit that in, right? You say aberrational thinking, or something like that, but no, there's a problem there. You have to think about that. So. Because not everybody the consensus is not 100% ever. And so decisions are always made. Whose consensus? Whose view is being privileged? And universities and other libraries make that decision all the time. And the other thing about scientific warrant is that there is this aura of permanence about something scientific, like once you've established it, it's good to go for 100 years. No. It's not. You think about the theoretical debates that are going on about biology that's being classified according to, appearance, and being classified according to DNA, and the arguments that go on about that. And they are converging now too. So there's lots of things that happen. That scientific warrant always seemed like a kind of insurance, for librarians. Well, science says so. But that warrants, pardon the pun, the same kind of scrutiny as you do for anything else, especially as we're getting more global, because the notions of science and what is scientific and what is acceptable. Educational warrant means that the classification is customized to a particular educational perspective, or I extend that this is Claire's notion, I extend it to mission as well. So, for example, NASA might very well have, the National Aeronautics and Space Agency in the United States might have its own classification because its mission requires a particular kind of view. But that isn't without its faults either, because you can lock it in, make it less changeable. So if I worked in a community college where we flipped all the nursing books to be in the medical section because it just made more sense that way. We didn't have a medical school, we did have a nursing school, so the classification, these Dewey numbers were like this, so we just moved them into the 616s. And the thing is, it's not compatible with any other institution that didn't make that particular adjustment to the mission-specific warrant. So here's the concept of cultural warrant, and this is, it's the assertion that a classification is the product of the culture that produced it. And it can apply to the scientific warrant or educational warrant or any of those, really, because they're all the product of the culture that produced it. But we typically talk about cultural warrant when we are criticizing a classification and we're saying that it's privileging certain cultural values and not others. So I'll give you an example. So some years ago, I went to the SIGCR workshop in Vancouver here, and Cheryl Metoyer, I don't know if that's how you pronounce her name. Do you know her? Metoyer. She was the keynote speaker, and she gave a talk on language, text, and knowledge organization, One Native American Story. And she described the difference in values and perspectives between Native American and Western cultures. And the whole thing started with, there was some kind of an exhibit, and the exhibit had plaques. You know, there were some kind of artifacts and photos, and then there were plaques next to these art objects saying what they were. And they were written by, you know, white people, not Indians, not First Nations people. And she said it's not that they were factually wrong. Well, sometimes they were factually wrong, but they did not reveal, they didn't say what it really meant from perspective. So here's a couple of examples she gave. And I can't remember which one is which, but because I took it from notes. And I haven't actually read the article. She didn't write an article. This was a keynote address. And so I think we are in the future, and the First Nations view would be present-oriented, scheduled versus non-schedule driven. We're schedule driven, and different view of the patterns of nature, the unity of nature. And here's the one that I think of as key to classification, which is the Native American perspective looks for the unique, not for the things that are the same. So while we're looking to cluster things, they're looking to pick out the thing that is different and anomalous, and that's the interesting part to them. And they classify things such as plants by how they're used rather than by their attributes. So they're right, and there's a whole list of these kinds of differences that are very nuanced, right? They're not that easy to kind of, to put into practice. So that she described the work, they created a thesaurus of American Indian terminology to accommodate not just that one collection that she was talking about, but any collection after that. They were building a large museum. I think this is a tribe in Connecticut. And so they started with the Library of Congress, and they looked to see what was there. And there were many things that were there that they could use, but also many that did not reflect the tribal view. They also went to the Art and Architecture thesaurus, thinking this would be a more up-to-date modern approach, and they used some of that. But the thing that they did the most was they interviewed people at length about tribal knowledge to see if there was enough commonality, because when you say Native American or First Nations, it's a very broad spectrum, to build one thesaurus, and they decided that there was. So, but what she described also was the fights they had and the acrimony that went into this. None of these kinds of projects are easy. They're not a cakewalk. You don't just, people care, and they say, no, that's not the same thing, that's different. And in the four domains are physical, mental, spiritual, and social. It's interesting, right? Because if you look at the Art and Architecture thesaurus, it's materials, processes, place, time, things like that, Ranganathan kind of stuff. And this definitely goes in a slightly different direction. And then they rewrote the plaques next to the objects, and we're happy. Happy end. So this was very inspiring to me because it just shows you that a classification can help express important truths. I got it. And it did it by capturing the underlying theory or the underlying perspective. I just want to quickly go through, my message, I guess, is to be mindful, when you are applying, creating, evaluating classifications. And here's some things that can happen with a classification over and above the elegance and parsimony over and above the different warrant. But now you've got it implemented. So what happens? So a classification can lead to inclusivity or marginalization for those who find themselves outside the structure. It can be used for determining inclusion and exclusion, such as illegal immigrants, transgender people, and so on. It can be used for labeling. So any parent who has had a child labeled with a developmental disorder knows the power of those labels, right? Puts your child in one class versus another class. And the fact is that people in power design the classifications, and then they have the power to change them. So in the United States, things like voting rights, women's rights, who gets to vote, who doesn't, who counts as a citizen, who doesn't, who can marry, who can't. There are all those implications. Many of the standards that we use are basically, if you look at them closely, little classification systems, and then we are stuck with them. There's a wonderful book by Bowker, he's the editor of it, about standards. And there's one in there about the size of coffins, who they use to measure for coffins and how that size has been changing. Bigger. Conflict resolution, many of the underlying things in conflict resolution are basically classification problems. When is something alive? When is something not alive? But just recently a court case of how you figure that and who decides. Is using drugs a crime or not? Whether it is a crime or isn't a crime, in your mind, is it a crime? What defines a crime? What defines a country? Think of all the wars fought over that, right? And then the whole thing is that you can institutionalize classification. So think about the medical profession with its specializations. We just think of them as, well, what? Moses brought them down, and pediatricians and ophthalmologists, and, right? So it's institutionalized to the point where the system doesn't function without that kind of classification being invoked. So no classification can represent all perspectives. Some get privileged, some get masked. And we know the process is inevitable. We as human beings can't not classify. We can't help it. We shouldn't help it because we wouldn't survive without it. And just summing up, how well does the classification live up to its warrant? Is the classification hospitable, expressive, memorable, requisite variety, and on down the line? And now I'd like you to look at your handout, and we'll take, before we start, are there any sort of quick questions about anything I said? Okay, so I teach a class on classification, and it's going right now. So this came to me just the other day. So it's a classification of coffee tastes by, just randomly, like I guess the guy was Googling, by the Specialty Coffee Association of America. Right? So what do you think of this classification? Pardon?
I'm just confused by salary.
Yeah. You like it? Right. So let me tell you. So that's a very good question, which it is used for a starting point for coffee tastings. You know how they have wine tastings, and these are called cupping sessions or something like that. They get people together and they taste coffees, and they do this at these boutique coffee. If you go to Hawaii and you go to Kona, there's like little mom and pop farms, and they sell their Kona coffee there and everything. But anyway, these are for people who go to coffee tastings, and it's a starting point for the discussion of the coffee flavor. So this isn't a trade classification. In other words, this isn't something that this organization created in order to be able to classify their coffee, for example, for sale or whatever. It is a mystique building, I guess, or that's my words, not theirs, but you know what I mean. So what do you think about it as just a classification? What strikes you right away about it? Yeah.
It's very systematic. We have each of the four main categories is divided into two, and then those two are also divided into two across the board.
Right. So does anybody want to comment on that? What are the chances of that happening? Right. So it's got a little scientific warrant there, right? Sour, salt, everybody, and then there's the umami, right? But there's the 4 places on your tongue that can taste those. And then it goes off into these others. What about that last column?
I don't even know what some of those
Oh, phenolic, like it'll taste like phenol. That's a chemical. You'd have to know what that smells like. What? Nippy, piquant. All right, so it's expressive in a particular kind of way, right? But
It also has an aura of mutual exclusiveness, right?
which I don't think would happen, right? So, like, how would you tell the difference between tart and tangy, or neutral? Yeah. Anyway, so there's a little bit of difficulty here in precise description, right? But I don't think it's all that bad. It's just that I think it's got this aura that if you make it all balanced, 2 by 2 by 2 by 2, that somehow that's good. Vertebrates and invertebrates is the way we divide up living beings, and there's like 98% of species are invertebrates, or 95, or some big, huge number are invertebrates, and only a small proportion are vertebrates. So the classification is way, way imbalanced. So that's not necessary for a classification to be useful. Yeah?
Are there studies about the appeal of classification systems? Like, does this kind of scientific-looking one appeal more than something that would be like maybe a tech cloud?
Well, imagine if it were just it could be like a paradigm, a matrix, right? And it would look pretty much the same. Yeah, people really like visual shape to it, and a visual kind of way to anchor it. But what I suspect is that in their efforts to make 2 by 2 by 2, they've been forcing some things in there that may not be that evident or may not be that, actually that true or useful. Okay, so that's an example. So now if you look at a classification like this in your lives, you go and you say, so who thought this one up? And if you just look at it there, you don't go to the website and look at all the other things, because they have other classifications then about aromas and all kinds of other interesting things that go with tasting coffee. So they want coffee tasting to become a thing. So let's move on to the next one, which is, so just the other week, I'm reading the New York Times, and there's an article which I really encourage you to read if you get it, if you can. Roughed up by an orca, there's a code for that. So what this has to do is the International Classification of Diseases, which was developed by the World Health Organization in the 1800s. Now, keep this in mind, this is a world classification of diseases, not an American one, or even a North American one. And it's been used in the U.S. since '79 for billing, for medical statistics, so comparing outcomes in emergency rooms from one hospital to another, gathering statistics on diseases, outbreaks, and flu and stuff like that, and since 2002 for billing. So now for billing, when you bill, you have to put a code, right? And record keeping, reimbursement of insurance. You lucky guys. My sister moved up here to be a doctor in Canada because she couldn't take it in the States anymore. And and public health statistics and assessment. But you have codes too. She complains a little bit about that. And then public health statistics, looking at evidence-based stuff, and then comparative studies. So just to give you a quick recap, here's what it looks like in the ICD-9. What they're talking about is the ICD-10, which is coming in the fall. And everybody's like, woohoo, getting ready for it and worrying how it's going to be. So this is what it would look like. It looks just like that. And so the old system had a length of 5 characters in the number. That's how far you could extend it. 14,000 diagnosis codes, 3,000 procedures, and they have this other thing about codes for place and situation, which is how you can get like injuries in an opera house and on other things. Now the new one, look at this, 68,000 diagnoses, 87,000 procedures, which means not just which vein, but which side of with that vein, like down to the microscopic almost level, and 7 characters, so, lots of room. So the early editions in this article, you read that, it used to be like you could have visitation of God was one code for the cause of disease. But the modern version includes things like sibling rivalry and injury on burning water skis, an attack by an orca, and injuries while knitting. And there's a bunch of others they mention. Okay, so the thing is, whose warrant is this? Who cares, right, that they go down to this precision and this expressivity and this added burden for medical staff to get it right. You don't get it right, you don't get paid. And some things will be reimbursable and some not. And the policy implications of recording various details, how to define them and what counts. But you can also see it as a treasure trove for mining this information, right? For looking at cross-national trends, for looking at the spread of diseases or the growth and, because right now somebody leaves an emergency room and it said, got stitches, or something like that. And where, why, under what circumstances. Now you can say, is this the patient's first visit or subsequent visit and so on. So, oops, not yet. My question is, what do you think of this? This trend towards the nth degree classifying for mixed purposes, for purposes of money, meaning insurance and remuneration, but also for science. Yeah.
Is there a move toward trend towards more expressiveness because of technology and automation of this process? I used to have to do that coding by hand.
Which ICD?
ICD-9.
Yeah.
And so, you would just do the 3-digit, kind of in that area, right?
Yeah.
But now, all of this is automated in the doctor's office, and so usually you don't have to do all that manual labor. So why not be as expressive as possible?
Right. So definitely, I think we do it because we can, right? So we don't have to do it manually. In fact, there probably are systems that would do it, so they would suggest the code to you, and if it's this code, you might also want that one, But what is your feeling about it as a librarian, as an organizer of knowledge, as a citizen of the world? Yeah.
So this is just a little vignette from one of my students who was doing a project on visual analytics. She looked at the global terrorism database, and what she observed from this data set is how much the definition of terrorism had changed over just very relatively short periods of time. So, this idea, I guess you could classify that as a kind of a cultural warrant of what we agree is terrorism versus what is just
freedom fighting, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, civil war, like in Syria.
Right.
So I think that when it comes to using it for the data mining for potential it's classification. We need that, but it's a fraught exercise because of how the concepts shift over time for various reasons. One of them being this, this idea that you brought forward of cultural model.
Yeah.
It reminds me of the Atlantic article that came out this month on the 69,000 genre categories that people have put in for Netflix. And that's being done in a totally uncontrolled way. They were saying it's very hard for people to find things. This will be true too. I mean, finding that one exact right code, not only to get paid, but just to be accurate.
Well,
that was an enormous reason.
what I think is, though, to be a little, to speak in favor of it, I think it's going to be like the DSM classification where they have, what do they call them, dimensions. So in the DSM, there's the mental disorder, but then there's the medical aspects, and then there's the social aspects. And you code it as a string, basically, of factors. So here you could have, stabbed in the thigh, and then the knitting needle is a separate, sort of. So you could look up any injury caused by a knitting needle, which is the beauty of facet analysis, right? So you could do that, yeah.
But one of the problems in media is not very patient-centric. It's not about it's not about the person.
No.
And I mean, just anecdotally in any of our lives, I know my sister's struggling with a number of illnesses, and her insurance won't pay for a particular drug because
It's experimental,
or it's it's more expensive, but she has this set of circumstances that make it warrant her having that, but because this is the way the insurance codes it, that's the way it's going to be. She's got to go through a lot of work to override it. So it's very much about as you said, paying the.
But you can think of it as paying, but you can also then think of it as, we know this stuff. Why not use it? In other words, we know that injuries happen in. But when you live in a litigious society too, knowing that hot coffee from McDonald's can burn you. I mean, come on. It's like. So, Luann, you had your hand up too.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, if I try to tie it to the idea of warrant, then I think that we've become very tolerant as a society for this data-centric approach to our lives. And so the idea that if we can collect it, we should collect it, and then later we'll think about how we use it is just broadly accepted now. But maybe it shouldn't be, right? There are downstream implications for how we collect this data.
Did you remember a few years ago there was the evidence base was that women should not have mammograms every year or something like that, right? And because the data showed that it didn't overall increase people living, right? And there was such a flare-up against it because even if you were to be proven that it's true, you don't want to be the one that's on the other side of that statistic, right? So there's that piece of it. And on the other hand, the third hand, you say, well, can we support, making people feel good about their preventive medicine, these expensive procedures and things like that. So, there's a lot of arguments to be made, and we want some of them to be made based on data and evidence because the anecdotal ones are sometimes just as harmful, right? And, I thought I saw a hand up, yep. And then we'll just take these two. Go ahead.
There's issues with that. It's automated. We can't do it. Why shouldn't we do it? But what if that's the ideal given context, especially in a Western context, where we have that capability. But what if other countries have used this classification and somebody still has to do it, or that it is difficult to make these diagnoses, then we end up with bad data.
You do, and when you think about what's considered normal and illness in some societies, I'm going to make this up probably offend somebody. But I could imagine in some societies having parasites is not considered that much of an illness because everybody does, to some extent. You know what I mean? It's not an illness in the sense of, you know, like you're considered a sick person. It's just one of those facts of life that you have, like dandruff. You know what I mean? I'm sounding worse and worse, but you know what I mean. There could be different perspectives of what constitutes an illness, especially mental illness, and trying to get international statistics on morbidity and all kinds of other things has always been a problem. I don't think that increasing the codes is going to help that, and I think you're very right. That's my personal opinion. And it'll prevent people from doing a good job. They'll just put in whatever digits, you know. And
so related to one of the core science is technology, and I see that a lot of those classifications, you know, change because of changes in technology. For example, the procedures, right? There are no procedures, but there are no technologies that allow those procedures to be conducted.
Yeah.
Maybe some reason for that, but one because it's just because the technology there could be used, maybe related to science and production of technology, but maybe not. But it's everything related also to charging for the use of that technology, right?
Yeah.
For the creation of the professions that are going to be in charge of using or being specialized in the use of that technology. So I think technology also is a strong.
Right. So one of my students just last night, he sent in his example of a classification was the industrial classification that they use in the States. I don't know if they use it here, but it classifies industries, you know, coal industry and this industry and that industry. And it's been given up. And it's very, very important because they measure, for example, economic growth and unemployment and all kinds of other things, leverage that classification to use in their data reporting and everything. They gave up on it because it does a terrible job of incorporating technology industry, service industry, in the, it's based on manufacturing or on, production of stuff or mining of stuff, extracting of stuff, and very little on, first of all, you can think of an industry that has several industries in it. I was thinking of the Kodak company with chemistry and, film, plastics and all kinds of other things that go into their industry and how it's changing and how do you classify that now. So they're working on expanding that classification. They constantly have to because they need the shorthand. They need something to be able to anchor what they say and have it standardized across agencies and so forth. But it's not that easy to do. Patents, mess. Yeah.
Just on the industrial codes. I really appreciate what you said about that because it's very important because these classifications are the architecture of so many different systems. And so I'm working with a group in the U.S. Treasury, for example, that are using these SIG codes to measure liquidity in the markets. And what I'm advocating is that they don't become too wedded to a particular classification, that we use different ways, and because I work with visualization technology, that we use different ways to group the data, and that we're constantly kind of churning it, looking for patterns, using different classifications so that we don't walk into particular, what I call model risk, where we have a mindset that is just...
Yeah, and it locks you in, and right. So guys, thank you. You've been really attentive, and thank you. That's my student, Charmaine.